He called her a cheap village mistake and threw $1 million in the dirt to buy her unborn child. Billionaire Obinna thought his status made him God, but he didn't realize Amara was a grandmaster playing a game he couldn't even see. Everyone thinks she took the cash and ran. They're dead wrong. She waited for the wedding night to spring a trap that would leave the Ekwueme empire in ashes. You won't believe her final move. Welcome to the Wanderer's Tales. Thank you for joining us. Uncover forbidden love, shocking secrets, and stories that defy tradition. When finished, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share. Thank you. The sun hung over the village square like a scorched copper coin, casting long, jagged shadows across the faces of the Ohanai's elders. Obinna Ekwueme stood in the center of the circle, his Italian leather shoes sinking into the fine, red dust of his ancestors, a dust he had spent his entire adult life trying to wash off in the infinity pools of Dubai and London. He looked profoundly out of place in his crisp white linen suit, a stark contrast to the heavy, indigo-dyed wrappers and the scent of local snuff that clung to the air. Beside him stood Amara, draped in a simple wax-print cloth, her eyes fixed not on him, nor on the elders, but on the ground, a posture Obinna mistook for submission. His father's influence, a shadow that stretched from the Senate chambers in Abuja down to the smallest local government office, had always been his shield. Yet here, under the ancient Irako tree, the air felt thick with a power that didn't recognize a billionaire's bank balance. The silence was tactical, heavy with the weight of 1,000 years of unwritten law. And for the first time in his life, Obinna felt the chilling sensation that he wasn't the hunter, but the prey. The head of the kindred, a man whose skin was as wrinkled as a dried plum, but whose eyes held the clarity of a hawk, finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. He explained that in this land, a man's seed did not belong to him simply because it came from his loins. It belonged to the soil on which it was planted until the proper rites had watered the ground. Obinna's lawyers had tried to argue custody laws and federal statutes, but their voices had been drowned out by the rhythmic thumping of the elders' staffs. The verdict was a razor-wire fence around Obinna's heart, because he had refused to pay the bride price, because he had treated the daughter of the soil like a common concubine. The child she carried was legally, traditionally, and eternally a member of her father's house, not his. Obinna felt a surge of hot, indignant blood rush to his face, his mind already racing toward a darker strategy. He looked at Amara, expecting to see a flicker of triumph, but her face remained a mask of village simplicity, a mask that hid the fact that she had just moved her first piece toward the edge of the board. 8 months earlier, the world had been Obinna's playground, a series of high-stakes negotiations and low-stakes flings. He had arrived in the eastern heartland not as a kinsman, but as a conqueror, flanked by a motorcade of black SUVs that kicked up a storm of grit, announcing the arrival of the Ekwueme dynasty. His father had secured the multi-billion naira contract to dualize the federal highway cutting through these ancestral groves, and Obinna was the face of the operation, the golden sun sent to oversee the destruction of old trees to make way for new asphalt. He viewed the project as a tedious necessity, a stepping stone to his next international acquisition, and he viewed the locals as mere extras in the movie of his life. To Obinna, the village was a relic of a dying past, a place where people lived in slow motion, unaware of the frantic, digital pulse of the modern world he inhabited. He carried his smartphone like a scepter, constantly barking orders into it, his voice slicing through the morning mist that settled over the palm fronds, a man who believed that if you had enough money, the universe would eventually bend to your will. The construction camp was a fortress of steel and air conditioning, a bubble of Lagos luxury dropped into the humid wilderness, and it was from this height that Obinna first surveyed his subjects. He spent his evenings on the veranda of his prefab villa, sipping 20-year-old scotch and watching the villagers return from their farms, their bodies lean and dark against the setting sun. He had a theory, one he often shared with his sycophantic assistants over cigars. Everything alive must react when I pass by. It wasn't just about his wealth. It was about the sheer gravitational pull of his presence. He expected the women to giggle and hide their faces, and the men to bow their heads in a mixture of resentment and awe. He had never met a wall he couldn't climb or a person he couldn't buy. And as he watched the village girls walking to the stream with basins on their heads, he began to look for a distraction, a way to pass the humid nights. He didn't see a community. He saw a menu, and he was hungry for something that tasted of innocence and earth. The encounter happened at the edge of the Odomiri River, where the water curled around ancient limestone rocks like a silver serpent. Obinna had stepped out of his armored G-Wagon to escape the suffocating silence of his own thoughts, his security detail trailing at a respectful, yet visible distance. That was when he saw her. Amara was standing knee-deep in the cooling current, her wrapper tucked high around her thighs, scrubbing a heavy basin with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. She didn't look up when the heavy door of the luxury SUV slammed shut, a sound that usually made the village children scatter like sparrows. She didn't turn when the scent of his expensive Creed Aventus cologne drifted across the humid air, clashing with the earthy aroma of wet moss and fermented cassava. Obinna stood on the bank, leaning against a mahogany tree, his arms folded across his chest as he waited for the inevitable, the reaction. In his world, a girl like this, seeing a man like him, should have dropped her sponge in a fit of giggles or adjusted her cloth with a shy, desperate modesty. He was the sun, and she was supposed to be the sunflower, turning her face to catch his golden light. But Amara continued her work, her movements steady and deliberate, as if the billionaire and his multi-million naira machinery were nothing more than a stubborn swarm of gnats in the afternoon heat. The silence stretched, becoming an insult that Obinna felt in the very marrow of his bones. He was a man who measured his worth by the tremors he caused in others, and this girl's indifference was a tectonic shift he wasn't prepared for. He walked closer, his polished boots crunching loudly on the gravel, a deliberate intrusion into her sanctuary. "The water looks cold," he said, his voice smooth as silk, the tone he used to close deals in high-rise boardrooms. Still, she didn't look at him. She simply wrung out a piece of cloth, the muscles in her forearms tensing with a strength that surprised him. Finally, she straightened her back, her gaze meeting his with a terrifying level of neutrality. There was no awe in her amber-flecked eyes, no recognition of the senator's son, no hunger for the watch on his wrist that could buy her entire family's land 10 times over. "The water is as it should be," she replied, her voice low and steady, lacking the high-pitched flutter of a girl being wooed. She picked up her basin, balanced it effortlessly on her head, and walked past him. As she brushed by, the scent of local black soap and sun-dried skin hit him, more intoxicating than any designer perfume. She didn't look back, and in that moment, Obinna's predatory instinct shifted from casual curiosity to a dark, obsessive hunger. He had found something alive that didn't react, and he would not rest until he had broken that stillness. The following weeks were a masterclass in calculated pursuit, as Obinna transitioned from a distant figure of power to a constant, hovering presence in Amara's daily life. He traded his fleet of SUVs for a more discreet pickup truck, though its price tag remained an obscene contrast to the mud brick houses he frequented. He began to show up at the village market, not to buy the expensive yams reserved for the wealthy, but to sit among the locals, feigning an interest in the rhythms of rural trade. He brought gifts, but he was too smart to lead with jewelry or cash. Instead, he brought sacks of high-grade fertilizer for her mother's farm and a sophisticated solar lamp, so Amara could read her nursing textbooks after the sun dipped below the horizon. He was weaving a web of dependency disguised as generosity, a tactic he had seen his father use to secure votes in the hinterlands. He spoke to her of the world beyond the red dust, of the lights of Paris, the skyscrapers of New York, and the crushing loneliness of a life where everyone wanted a piece of his soul, but no one cared for his heart. It was a lie, a beautiful, polished performance designed to lower her guard, playing on the universal human desire to be the one who truly understands a misunderstood giant. Amara watched him with a patience that should have warned him. She accepted his company, allowing him to walk her home from the clinic where she volunteered, listening to his grand tales with a slight, enigmatic smile. To Obinna, this smile was a sign that the fortress was crumbling, that the village girl was finally being seduced by the gravity of his world. He didn't realize that she was observing his patterns the way her father had taught her to observe a draft opponent. She saw how he checked his watch every 10 minutes, how he treated his driver with a casual, invisible cruelty, and how his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings for a better vantage point. He thought he was hunting a gazelle, but he was actually walking onto a board where every move he made was being logged into a mental database of weaknesses. He told her she was different, pure, and the only real thing in his artificial life, cliches that had worked on 100 women before her. She would nod, her eyes fixed on the horizon, while her mind was 3 moves ahead, wondering why a man who claimed to value her purity was so intent on dragging her into the shadows of his complexity. He was playing for her body and her submission, unaware that she was playing for his very foundation. The first real crack in Obinna's confidence appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, under the shade of the mango tree behind Amara's family compound. On the weathered wooden table sat a draft board, a local version of checkers, carved from a single piece of Irako wood, its squares smoothed by decades of sliding bottle caps and stones. Obinna, seeing the board, laughed with a patronizing warmth, challenging Amara to a game to pass the time. He expected a quick victory, a way to further establish his intellectual dominance over this simple girl. He played with a fast, aggressive style, sacrificing his pieces with a flourish, confident that his superior education and global perspective would easily overcome her folk knowledge. He talked throughout the game, trying to distract her with stories of his father's power and the million-dollar contracts that were signed with a flick of a pen. He didn't notice that Amara had fallen into a deep, meditative silence, her fingers hovering over the smooth bottle caps with the precision of a surgeon. She wasn't just playing the game. She was reading the rhythm of his arrogance, waiting for the moment when his desire to win would blind him to the trap she was laying. As the game progressed, the atmosphere shifted from playful to stifling. Obinna found himself backed into a corner, his kings trapped by a series of seemingly insignificant pieces he had ignored in his rush to dominate the center of the board. Every time he thought he had found an opening, Amara would slide a piece into place, forcing him into a move that cost him more than he gained. "You're overthinking it," he muttered, his brow furrowing as a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. She didn't respond. She simply made a double jump, clearing 3 of his pieces in one swift motion. When the final move came, Obinna sat staring at the board in disbelief. He had been wiped out. "You got lucky," he said, forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, his ego bruised in a way that no amount of money could soothe. Amara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a spark of something sharp and dangerous in her gaze. "In draft, Obinna, there is no luck," she said softly, resetting the board. "There is only the person who sees the end from the beginning, and the person who is too busy looking at themselves to see the trap." He brushed it off as a fluke, but that night, for the first time, he dreamed of being lost in a forest where the trees were shaped like giant checkers, closing in on him. The seduction reached its inevitable crescendo during the village's New Yam Festival, a night when the air was thick with the scent of roasted tubers, palm wine, and the frantic beating of ceremonial drums. Obinna had orchestrated the evening with the precision of a gala, donating a massive sum to the community fund to ensure he was the guest of honor, and more importantly, to ensure Amara was by his side. Under the cloak of the festivities, away from the prying eyes of the elders and the flickering torches of the dancers, he took her to the edge of the forest where the construction equipment sat like sleeping beasts. He spoke of a future that didn't exist, a life in Lagos where she would be the queen of his empire, where her mother would never have to touch the soil again, and where their children would grow up with the world at their feet. He used the word love like a weapon, firing it into the silence of the night, knowing its power to bypass the logic of even the smartest women. He promised her a traditional union that would be finalized once the road project was completed, a vague commitment that sounded like a vow to an untrained ear. That night, Amidst the distant echoes of the flutes and the heavy humidity of the rainy season, Obinna finally achieved his goal. He moved with a practiced tenderness, a performance of passion that was actually a victory lap for his ego. To him, the act of conception, though he didn't know it was happening at the time, was the ultimate reaction he had been seeking since the day of the stream. He felt a surge of triumph as she yielded to him, believing he had finally broken the stillness of the girl who wouldn't bow. He saw the tears in her eyes and interpreted them as a sign of her total surrender to his greatness, never considering that they might be tears for the innocence she was intentionally sacrificing to set her own trap. As he held her in the dark, his mind was already drifting back to the city, to the boardrooms and the high society parties he missed. He had won the game, or so he thought, and like any spoiled child, he was already beginning to lose interest in the toy he had fought so hard to possess. He didn't see Amara's hand gripping the red earth beneath them, her fingers digging in as if she were anchoring herself for the long, cold wait that was to come. When the road project reached its halfway point and the political climate in Abuja shifted, Obinna's departure was as abrupt and sterile as a surgical incision. There were no long goodbyes, no lingering glances at the village square. There was only the roar of the SUVs and the dust that swallowed the motorcade as it sped toward the airport. He sent one of his assistants to Amara's house with an envelope of cash and a new smartphone, a gesture he considered more than generous for a village fling. He didn't call her, and when she tried to reach him, her calls were diverted to a professional secretary who informed her that Mr. Ekwueme is currently in a high-level meeting and cannot be disturbed. In the high-octane world of Lagos, Amara became a blurred memory, a footnote in his eastern expedition. He returned to his life of yacht parties and international business deals, boasting to his friends about the untamed beauty he had conquered in the heart of Igboland. He felt a sense of relief to be back among people who spoke his language, the language of wealth, cynicism, and disposable relationships. Back in the village, the silence that followed his departure was louder than the construction noise had ever been. Amara watched the smartphone he gave her as it sat on the wooden table, its screen dark and cold, a symbol of the hollow promises he had left behind. She didn't cry in public, nor did she spend her days pining by the road where he had left. Instead, she returned to her books and the draft board, her face becoming even more of a mask as the whispers in the market began to grow. The villagers, who had once looked at her with envy, now looked at her with a pity that was far more cutting. They saw a girl who had been used and discarded by a big man, a story as old as the hills that surrounded them. But Amara wasn't looking for pity. She was observing the physical changes in her body with a clinical detachment. She knew that the seed of the billionaire was growing inside her, and she knew exactly how much that seed was worth to a man whose father obsessed over legacy and the family bloodline. She began to study the traditional laws of her people with the same intensity she had studied her nursing manuals, looking for the legal hooks that would turn her predicament into a position of absolute power. The reality of her pregnancy hit the village like a sudden thunderstorm, breaking the tension of the whispers and turning them into a flood of judgment. Morning after morning, Amara found herself bent over the pit latrine, her body racked by the violent rejection of the life growing within her. Her mother, a woman whose hands were calloused by years of survival, watched her daughter with a mixture of heartbreak and a quiet, simmering rage. The shame was a tangible weight in the small compound, but Amara refused to bow under it. When the village elders sent word that her father's name was being dragged through the mud, she didn't hide. She walked to the village square with her head held high, her stomach still flat but her resolve already swelling. She knew that in this culture, an unmarried pregnant woman was a tragedy, but a woman who carried the child of the senator's son was a political liability. She wasn't just carrying a baby. She was carrying a piece of the Ekwueme empire, and she knew that eventually the predator would have to return to the scene of the hunt. She began to spend her evenings playing draft with the old men of the village, the ones who had known her father and who understood the deep, ancestral laws of the land. Between moves, she asked questions not about love or marriage, but about the rights of a child born outside of the Ikuaka. She learned that in their specific Igbo tradition, if a man did not perform the rites and pay the bride price, he had zero claim to the child. The child belonged entirely to the woman's family, effectively making the billionaire a stranger to his own heir. This was the kingship move she had been waiting for. She knew Obinna's ego would never allow him to lose something that belonged to him, especially not to a village girl he thought he had defeated. She prepared herself for the inevitable moment when his arrogance would turn into desperation, and when he would realize that in this forest, his father's millions were just paper, while the traditional law was the very earth he walked upon. She wasn't a victim waiting for a savior. She was a strategist waiting for her opponent to make the one move he couldn't take back. The news of the pregnancy did not travel to Lagos via a tearful phone call or a desperate letter. It arrived on the wings of village gossip that eventually reached the ears of Senator Ekwueme's political rivals. In the shark-infested waters of Nigerian politics, a bastard grandchild from a marginalized community was not just a family scandal. It was a tactical weakness that could be used to question the senator's moral standing before the upcoming primary elections. When the senator summoned Obinna to his sprawling estate in Osso Drive, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the cold, clinical aura of a man who viewed his family as a corporate brand. The senator didn't ask about Amara's well-being, nor did he express a grandfather's joy. He paced the length of his mahogany-paneled library, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he outlined the disaster. An Ekwueme child does not belong to a mudhouse lineage, he spat, his eyes burning with the fires of a man who had built an empire on the acquisition of assets. He commanded Obinna to return to the village and settle the matter, not with a wedding ring, but with a checkbook and a fleet of lawyers, convinced that every village girl had a price that, once met, would make her vanish into the humid mists of the east. Obinna sat in the high-backed velvet chair, feeling the weight of his father's expectations like a physical pressure on his chest. For the first time, his usual playboy swagger felt like a cheap costume. He realized that this was no longer a game of seduction. It was a recovery mission for a biological asset. His father's instructions were clear. By the girl's silence, take the child as soon as it was born and ensure the lineage remained pure and within their control. Obinna's mind raced as he calculated the cost, mentally reviewing the millions he could siphon from the road project to make this problem go away. He pictured Amara's small compound, her mother's worn hands, and the simple draft board, and he felt a surge of arrogant confidence. He believed that the power of the Ekwueme name, backed by the raw force of federal influence, would make the village elders tremble and the girl capitulate. He didn't see the irony of his situation, that he was preparing to fight a war on ground he didn't understand, using weapons that had no value in the court of ancestral spirits. He left the library with a predatory grin, ready to play what he thought was his winning card, unaware that the senator's interference was exactly the forced move Amara had been waiting for. The return to the village was not the triumphant entrance Obinna had envisioned. This time, there were no cheering crowds or children chasing the SUVs. There was only a chilling, heavy silence that seemed to emanate from the very trees. He arrived at Amara's compound with a briefcase full of high-denomination notes and a legal document that looked like a surrender treaty. He expected to find a weeping girl and a grateful mother, but instead, he was met by the Amuna, the council of men from Amara's kindred, seated in a semicircle of low wooden stools. They didn't look at the money. They didn't look at his polished shoes. They looked through him, their faces as unyielding as the ancient stone altars in the sacred grove. Obinna began his pitch, speaking of compensation, opportunities in the city, and the superior upbringing the child would have in his care. He spoke for 20 minutes, his voice growing increasingly desperate as he met only stony glares. When he finally opened the briefcase to reveal the stacks of cash, the eldest man, a veteran of 100 village disputes, simply spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dust at Obinna's feet. The rejection was a physical blow to Obinna's ego. The elder spoke in a dialect so deep and proverb-laden that Obinna had to rely on his trembling driver to translate the crushing reality. A child is not a goat to be traded in the market. the elder declared, his voice echoing against the mud walls. He explained that because Obinna had bypassed the sacred rites of Ikuaka and Iemi Igonwani, the child carried no part of the Ekwueme name in the eyes of the land. In this jurisdiction, the billionaire was a legal ghost. The law of the ancestors stated clearly that a child born of a woman whose bride price had not been paid belonged solely and eternally to the woman's father. No amount of money could change the blood. No senator's decree could rewrite the spiritual ledger of the Igbo people. Obinna looked at Amara, who stood in the doorway of her mother's kitchen, her arms crossed, her face a mask of serene indifference. He realized with a jolt of horror that he was being denied his own flesh and blood. He was a billionaire who owned skyscrapers, but in this small circle of red earth, he owned nothing. He was being checkmated by a law that didn't care about his bank balance. And for the first time, the golden sun felt the cold sting of absolute powerlessness. Desperation is a scent that predators recognize instantly, and as Obinna sat in the back of his SUV that night, he smelled it on his own skin. He couldn't return to Abuja empty-handed. His father's wrath was a force more terrifying than any village curse. He realized that the only way to own the child was to own the mother, at least on paper. He returned to Amara's compound the next morning, but this time he came alone, stripped of his security detail and his briefcase of bribes. He found her sitting by the draft board, her fingers tracing the patterns of the wood. "I'll marry you," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He tried to make it sound like a grand romantic gesture, a billionaire descending from his throne to lift a village girl into the clouds. But his voice lacked the velvet charm of their first encounters. He spoke of a grand wedding in Lagos, a life of luxury, and a formal union that would satisfy both the elders and the law. He was offering her a golden cage, intending to use the marriage as a legal bridge to gain custody of the child, after which he planned to file for a quick, quiet divorce and cast her back into the dust. Amara didn't jump for joy. She didn't even look surprised. She moved a bottle cap on the board, her eyes fixed on the game. "A marriage is a serious thing, Obinna," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made him uneasy. "It is not a road project that you finish and walk away from." She let him sweat in the humid morning air, watching the way his eyes darted around the compound, looking for an exit strategy even as he proposed a union. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to buy the peace he had lost by changing the rules of the game. But she also knew that a marriage contract was a two-way street. And in the city, the laws of men were just as intricate as the laws of the ancestors. She agreed to his proposal, but with a condition that sounded like a simple request for security for her and her mother. She insisted that since they were to live in his world, the marriage must be governed by a civil contract, one that protected her honor as a daughter of the soil. Obinna nearly laughed with relief. He would give her any contract she wanted, knowing his high-priced Lagos lawyers would ensure it was a document of her own undoing. He thought he was leading her into a trap. He didn't realize he was handing her the pen she would use to sign away his empire. Back in the glass and steel towers of Lagos, Obinna met with his lead counsel, a man whose soul had been replaced by a series of billable hours and legal loopholes. They sat in an office overlooking the Atlantic, drafting a prenuptial agreement that was essentially a document of dispossession. The plan was brilliant in its cruelty. The marriage would be legal, giving Obinna parental rights, but the cheating clause and the lifestyle requirements were rigged so that Amara would be in constant breach of the contract. Obinna wanted a zero-liability exit. He instructed his lawyer to include clauses that would strip her of any alimony, any share of his assets, and most importantly, any custody rights should the marriage dissolve. He viewed Amara as an illiterate girl who would be dazzled by the legalese and the sheer volume of paper. He wanted her to feel small, to feel that she was lucky to even be allowed to breathe the filtered air of his penthouses. "Make it look standard," Obinna instructed, a smirk playing on his lips. "Make it look like I'm protecting her, while I'm actually burying her." However, the draftsman's daughter was not the simpleton they imagined. When the thick stack of documents arrived at the village via a high-speed courier, Amara didn't sign them immediately. She took them to the local clinic, where she used the high-speed internet she had insisted Obinna provide to research every term, every subclause, and every hidden whereas. She spent nights cross-referencing Nigeria matrimonial law with the specific wording of the Ekwueme family trust. Her father had always told her, in a game of draft, your opponent will always try to make you look at his right hand while his left hand is removing your king. She saw the trap within the first 10 pages, the way the custody was tied to moral fitness, a subjective term Obinna's wealth could easily manipulate. She didn't panic. Instead, she contacted a young, hungry human rights lawyer she had met during her nursing outreach, a woman who specialized in the intersection of traditional and civil law. Together, they began to draft amendments, small, seemingly harmless additions hidden in the dense prose, including a mutual fidelity clause with a staggering financial penalty that Obinna, in his arrogance, wouldn't even bother to read closely because he never intended to be faithful anyway. When Obinna received the amended documents, he barely glanced at the minor changes Amara had requested. His lawyer chuckled, dismissing them as the sentimental ramblings of a village girl trying to protect her virtue. One of the additions was a clause that specified a massive transfer of liquid assets and property titles into a trust for the child and the mother, triggered only in the event of proven marital misconduct by the husband. To Obinna, this was a joke. He was the king of his world, and he believed he was too smart to ever be proven to be anything. He saw it as a desperate attempt by Amara to feel secure, a village prenup that his father's influence could easily quash in any Lagos courtroom. He signed the papers with a flourish of his gold-plated fountain pen, feeling a rush of adrenaline. He had done it. He had secured the heir, satisfied the senator, and set the stage for a divorce that would leave Amara with nothing but her memories of the city. He sent a private jet to fetch her, already planning the victory party he would throw once the ring was on her finger and the child was legally in Ekwueme. Amara boarded the jet with a single suitcase and her father's draft board. As the plane climbed above the clouds, leaving the red dust of the east behind, she looked out the window at the winding rivers below. She wasn't thinking about the diamonds Obinna had sent or the designer clothes waiting for her in Lagos. She was thinking about the sacrifice play in draft, the move where you intentionally allow your opponent to take one of your pieces so that you can jump over his entire front line and reach the king square. She knew that by entering his world, she was stepping into enemy territory, but she also knew that Obinna's greatest weakness was his belief that he was the only one playing the game. He saw her as a piece to be moved. She saw him as a board to be conquered. She felt the child kick in her womb, a rhythmic reminder of the stakes. "We are almost there," she whispered to herself, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of a bottle cap piece she had kept in her pocket. The village girl was gone. In her place was a grandmaster who had already seen the final move, 10 chapters before the end. The wedding was a grotesque display of wealth, a society event of the year, held at a luxury hotel in Victoria Island. The guest list was a who's who of Nigerian power, ministers, CEOs, and oil magnates, all gathered to witness the union of the Ekwueme dynasty and the mysterious beauty from the east. Obinna moved through the crowd like a conqueror, his chest puffed out, accepting congratulations for taming the wild. He looked at Amara, draped in a custom-made lace gown that cost more than her village's entire annual harvest, and felt a sense of ownership that was almost intoxicating. She was a trophy, a beautiful, silent accessory to his greatness. He whispered promises of forever into her ear for the cameras, while in his mind, he was already counting down the months until he could serve her the papers. He felt he had regained his status as the man who never loses, the man who manipulated tradition and law to get exactly what he wanted. Amara played her role to perfection. She was the shy, overwhelmed bride, eyes downcast, speaking only when spoken to, a performance that reinforced Obinna's belief in her simplicity. She endured the flashbulbs and the patronizing comments from Obinna's socialite friends with a grace that was as cold as marble. During the reception, as the senator gave a booming speech about legacy and the strength of the Ekwueme blood, Amara looked across the room and caught the eye of her lawyer, who was seated at a distant table. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. The marriage was now a legal reality, and the fidelity clause was live, a ticking time bomb buried deep within the stack of signed papers in Obinna's safe. As they took their first dance, Obinna held her tight, his hand possessive on her waist. He thought he was holding his future. He didn't realize he was holding the person who had just systematically dismantled it. The music was loud, the champagne was flowing, and the trap was now fully set, waiting for the billionaire to make the one mistake he had spent his entire life making. Life in the Ekwueme mansion in Ikoyi was a choreographed performance of silence and steel. The house was a marvel of glass and white marble, a cold, echoing cathedral dedicated to Obinna's vanity. To the outside world, Amara was the luckiest woman in Nigeria, a village girl plucked from obscurity to live among the clouds, draped in silks that cost more than a rural hospital. But to Amara, the mansion was simply a larger version of the draft board, a space where every shadow held a secret and every servant was a potential informant. She spent her days in the nursery she had designed with clinical precision, a soft sanctuary of pastel blues and hand-carved irako, wood that smelled of home. She played the role of the dutiful, quiet wife to perfection, never questioning Obinna's late-night business meetings or the lingering scent of expensive, unfamiliar perfume on his collars. She was a ghost in her own home, moving through the high-ceilinged rooms with a stillness that Obinna mistook for brokenness. He saw her silence as proof that the city had finally swallowed her whole, that the village fire he had once found so intoxicating had been extinguished by the sheer weight of his wealth. He began to treat her like a piece of furniture, valuable, decorative, but ultimately inanimate, unaware that she was documenting every late-night return, every slurred phone call, and every careless slip of his gilded tongue. While Obinna was busy reclaiming his throne in the Lagos nightlife, Amara was building a digital fortress. She had traded her nursing textbook for volumes on maritime law, asset protection, and the intricate web of shell companies that formed the Ekwueme family trust. She knew that in the city, information was the only currency that didn't devalue. She watched from the shadows of the mezzanine as Obinna hosted strategy sessions that were little more than drug-fueled celebrations of his own perceived brilliance. He spoke openly about his plans to discard the village baggage once the baby was old enough to be moved to a private estate in London. He laughed about the stupid prenup she had signed, mocking the clauses he hadn't even bothered to read, convinced that his father's connections made him immune to the law. Amara would sit in the dark, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of a bottle cap she kept in her pocket, visualizing the board. She wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was simply waiting for the moment when Obinna's arrogance would push him into the dead zone, that part of the board where every possible move leads to a loss. She was the hunter now, and the mansion was her blind. The trap didn't spring because of a mistake. It sprang because of Obinna's absolute conviction that he was untouchable. It was the night of the Ekwueme Group's 25th anniversary gala, an event where the senator intended to announce his bid for the presidency. The mansion was swarming with the elite, a sea of black ties and shimmering gowns. Obinna, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of ego and expensive cognac, decided that this was the perfect night to display his ultimate conquest. He didn't see Amara as a person. He saw her as a shield to protect his public image while he indulged his private vices. In a hidden suite on the third floor, away from the thrumming bass of the ballroom, Obinna was caught in a position of undeniable compromise with the daughter of a rival political dynasty. He thought he had secured the perimeter, but he had forgotten one thing. The simple village girl knew every inch of that house better than he did. She didn't burst in with a scream. She didn't play the part of the scorned woman. Instead, she ensured that a very specific set of high-definition security cameras, installed under the guise of nursery safety, recorded every second of the betrayal. As the recording climbed into the cloud, Amara stood on the balcony overlooking the Lagos lagoon, the salt air whipping her hair. She felt the kick of the child in her womb, a reminder that the stakes were no longer just about her. Below her, the party continued, a hollow celebration of a man who was already a ghost in his own empire. Obinna emerged from the suite an hour later, adjusting his cufflinks with a smug grin, believing he had successfully navigated another night of dual lives. He walked over to Amara, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder, whispering about how beautiful she looked in the diamonds he had bought her. She smiled at him, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in months. It was the smile of a grandmaster who had just realized their opponent was about to walk into a triple jump. "I hope you enjoyed your evening, Obinna," she said softly, her voice as steady as the tide. He laughed, thinking she was being submissive, unaware that she had just pulled the pin on a grenade that was currently sitting in her lawyer's inbox. The game was over. He just hadn't looked at the board yet. The morning after the gala, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted from celebration to a cold, clinical war. Obinna, feeling emboldened by his father's successful announcement, decided it was time to finalize his exit strategy. He summoned Amara to his study, where his high-priced lawyer sat with a silver briefcase and a look of professional boredom. Obinna didn't offer her a seat. He simply slid a set of divorce papers across the mahogany desk, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "It's over, Amara," he said, his voice dripping with a patronizing pity. "I've given you a year of luxury, but let's be honest, you don't belong here. The child stays with me. You get a generous relocation fee and a one-way ticket back to the East. Consider it a bonus for your service." He watched her face, waiting for the breakdown, the tears, the desperate begging of a village girl who had just lost her lottery ticket. He wanted to feel the rush of winning, the thrill of finally discarding the piece he no longer needed. Amara didn't touch the papers. She didn't even look at them. She looked at Obinna's lawyer, then back at her husband, and she began to laugh. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was a low, melodic sound that chilled the air in the room. "You really haven't changed, Obinna," she said, leaning forward. "You still think the game is about who has the loudest voice." She signaled to the door, and her own lawyer, the young, fierce woman from the East, walked in, carrying a folder that looked much thinner than Obinna's, but felt infinitely heavier. Amara's lawyer placed a single document on the desk, a counterfiling for divorce based on the marital misconduct clause of their prenuptial agreement. "We aren't here to discuss relocation fees, Mr. Ekwueme," the lawyer said, her voice like a scalpel. "We are here to discuss the automatic transfer of 40% of your personal liquid assets and the title of the Ekwueme family estate in Enugu, as triggered by the fidelity breach recorded at 11:42 p.m. last night." Obinna's smirk vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor as he realized that the sentimental village clauses he had ignored were actually a set of iron jaws that had just clamped shut around his throat. The legal meeting turned into a bloodbath of fine print and panicked whispers. Obinna's lawyer frantically scanned the prenup, his hands trembling as he realized the magnitude of the oversight. The cheating clause wasn't just a moral penalty. It was a lethal financial trigger tied to a specific moral fitness definition that Amara had tailored to match the senator's own public platform. Because the senator's political brand was built on traditional family values, any public scandal involving Obinna's infidelity would not only trigger the asset transfer to Amara, but would also legally disqualify Obinna from his position in the family trust, a clause the senator himself had insisted on years ago to keep his son in line. Amara had simply linked the two. By cheating on Amara, Obinna hadn't just lost a wife. He had effectively fired himself from his father's empire. The video evidence was undeniable, high definition, and already mirrored across 3 different servers in 3 different countries. "You can't do this," Obinna hissed, his voice cracking. "My father will burn your village to the ground. He has judges in his pocket. He has the police." Amara stood up, her presence suddenly filling the room, her eyes burning with a fire that made the billionaire flinch. "Your father is a politician, Obinna. And right now, he is a politician who is 6 months away from an election. Do you think he will protect a son who just handed his rivals the evidence to destroy his career? Or do you think he will cut off the infected limb to save the body?" She let the question hang in the air, a cold truth that Obinna knew was inescapable. The draftsman's daughter had understood the political board better than the senator's own son. She had used Obinna's own greed and his father's ambition to create a situation where the only way Obinna could win was to never have played the game in the first place. He sat back in his chair, looking at the draft board on the side table, the one he had bought to mock her, and realized that every move he had made for the last year had been dictated by her. The aftermath was a swift and brutal deconstruction of a dynasty. When the senator saw the evidence, he didn't scream. He simply looked at Obinna with a cold, dead disappointment that was far worse than rage. To save his political campaign, the senator was forced to publicly endorse the settlement, framing it as a generous gift to his beloved daughter-in-law to ensure she and the child were cared for. Behind closed doors, he stripped Obinna of his titles, his access to the family accounts, and the multi-billion naira road contracts that had started the whole ordeal. Obinna went from being the golden son to a persona non grata in the very circles he had once ruled. He found himself in a modest apartment on the mainland, his fleet of SUVs replaced by a single, aging sedan, his friends vanishing like smoke in a harmattan wind. He had tried to be wickedly smart, but he had forgotten that a man who plays only for himself eventually finds he has no one left to move his pieces. Amara, meanwhile, moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had finally achieved her objective. She didn't stay in Lagos to gloat. She waited until the birth of her son, a healthy, bright-eyed boy who looked exactly like her father, and then she packed her bags. She didn't take the diamonds or the designer clothes. She took the settlement, the title to the Enugu estate, and the draft board. The news of the village girl who broke a billionaire became a legend in the East, a story whispered in the markets and the palm wine bars. She had used the system that was designed to exploit her to instead secure a future for her child and her community. She wasn't just a survivor. She was the architect of her own justice. As she signed the final divorce decree, she didn't feel a sense of triumph, only a deep, resonant peace. She had played the game to its conclusion, and for the first time in her life, the board was clear. The story ends where it began, in the red dust of the village square. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Amara sat under the same Irako tree where the elders had once delivered their verdict. She wasn't standing in the center, waiting for judgment. She was sitting on a stool of her own, the new owner of the lands that stretched as far as the eye could see. She had used the settlement to build a modern clinic and a school that focused on both tradition and technology, ensuring that no girl in her village would ever have to rely on a big man's mercy again. Across from her sat a young girl from the village, her eyes bright with curiosity as they played a game of draft. Amara moved her piece with a practiced flick of her wrist, a double jump that landed her in the back row. "King me," she said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. In the distance, the roar of a single, dust-covered car could be heard. It was Obinna, who had driven all the way from Lagos to see his son, a right he now had to ask permission for. He stood at the edge of the square, looking at the woman he had once thought he could buy, seeing her not as a village girl, but as a force of nature he had been too small to understand. He didn't approach. He simply watched from the shadows, a man who had lost everything because he didn't realize that in life, as in draft, the smallest piece can take the king if you don't respect the board. Amara didn't look up. She focused on the girl across from her, teaching her the most important lesson her father had ever taught her. "Never look at what they are taking from you," Amara whispered, moving her final piece into place. "Look at where they are forced to stand after they take it. That is where you win." She made the final jump, clearing the board, as the sun set over the east, painting the world in the color of gold and ancient, unyielding red. He tried to steal her baby, so she legally stole his entire life. Now, the billionaire is penniless while the village girl owns his father's company. Is she a brilliant strategist getting justice, or a heartless gold digger who played too dirty? The internet is losing its mind over this ending. Drop if she was right to take it all, or comment too far if she's the real villain. Click below for the full story.